Not too soon. I got half hour, 40 minutes.
Okay, then. So the Rambam opens up Perek Daled Milchus Chanuka with the following opening sentence: Mitzvah sa sheyeh kol bayis ubayis madlik ner echad. And then the Rambam goes on to the Mahadrin and so forth. Now, there's a change in the Rambam's language from that we have in the Gemara. The Gemara says ner ish ubeso. So the emphasis here is on the ish, meaning on the individual. It's like an individual obligation. It's not some sort of collective obligation. And the Rambam changes it. He has a different language. He says, Shia kol bayis ubayis madlik. Notice the Rambam never identifies a person as an individual who's obligated in Ner Chanukah. It's, so to speak, the bias as a collective entity that's chayiv in Ner Chanukah. We can only say, according to the Rambam, that the bias has to be equipped with a Ner Chanukah. For example, if we have a family living in a house, who has to put up the mezuzah? You really can't point to any individual and say, well, he has to put up the mezuzah, she has to put up, we all have to put up the mezuzah. The bias has to be equipped with a mezuzah. And so too, the Rambam in Chanukah, using almost the identical language that he uses in Hilchas Mezuzah, requires that each bias be equipped with a ner. How much? One ner, and that's it. So that in the terminology of brisk, we would call it a chovas bias. And then the question becomes, what happens with someone who has no bias? Well, what do I mean he has no bias? He might be a person who lives outside the bias. He just doesn't have a bias. He's homeless, as we would say. Or perhaps we could even talk about a person who has a bias, but he has no possibility of lighting an Ner Chanukah in his bias. We could talk about a person who's traveling on a plane or on a ship. And if assuming that a plane or a ship is not a bias, then at this particular moment in time, he has no bias. So are we going to say that such a person without a bias is patur, is exempt from the mitzvah Ner Chanukah? And only someone who has a house is chayiv in Ner Chanukah. That's a pretty radical position. But again, if we accept that analogy to mezuzah, then certainly if I live, in the streets, I don't have an obligation to put up a mezuzah. And so too in Ner Chanukah, someone without a house would therefore not be chayiv in Ner Chanukah. So what we want to do is we want to study this question from two different angles. And I'll just give them titles and then I'll explain what I have in mind. There's something called a birchas haroeh, which means that if I see your candle lit in your bias, then I make a brach. And that's a sugya in Masechta Shabbos, and Tosfos analyzes this in Masechta Sukkah, as we'll soon see. And the very notion that somebody sees a candle lit in someone else's house, makes a bracha on it, seems to indicate a broadening of the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. Because this is your bias, it's not my bias. So why should I be making a bracha on the ner in your bias? That's going to be our first discussion. And the second discussion I want to pick up with you is a sugya in Shabbos Chav Gimel called achsenoi, which means a guest in someone's house, is he obligated in Ner Chanukah? We'll see exactly A, if he's obligated Ner Chanukah, and B, how he fulfills this mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. But again, according to the Rambam, if the mitzvah is on the bias, you begin to wonder why there's an obligation on the Achsanoi. So we're going to try to put things into some perspective. So this shir is more of a lumda shir than halacha l'maisa. I mean, I think it will have repercussions halacha l'maisa, but we're going to base ourselves on a sefer called the Harerei Kedem, which is a compilation of some of the insights of Rav Soloveitchik on many different topics. But we're going to look at this particular one with regard to the nature and the definition of the obligation of Ner Chanukah. So we start with the Birchas HaRoeh, and Tosas in Sukkah on Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph, if you want to make a note of it, goes back and forth about the whole nature and purpose of Birchas HaRoeh. And he says the following: we don't find Birchas HaRoeh in the case of Lulav or Sukkah. There was no takana that if I see your Lulav or your Sukkah, I make a bracha. Why then is there a separate takana that was made, a bracha for the Roeh, for someone who sees someone else's Ner Chanukah? And Tosas says that Yesh kama b'nei adam she'ein lem batim v'ein b'yodam l'kayim ha-mitzvah. Tosas is saying that Chachamim were worried about someone who doesn't have a house. He's homeless. Does that therefore exclude him from the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah? After all, he's chayiv in Sukkah, he's chayiv in Lulav, but in Ner Chanukah he doesn't have a bias. So a takana was made allowing him to be makayim a mitzvah and even recite a bracha on someone else's Ner Chanukah. So I see your Ner Chanukah over there. I don't have a bias. I can't fulfill the mitzvah of bias, but yet I can fulfill the mitzvah of Chanukah through Re'iyah. And you might ask the following question. Mezuzah, right? There's no bracha that we recite when we see someone else's mezuzah. So if the Rabbana made a takana on behalf of someone who has no bias, and they established that he can dip into the mitzvah of Chanukah by making a bracha on someone else's Ner Chanukah, why didn't they do the same thing on behalf of that same person who doesn't have a bias and allow him to make a bracha on someone else's mezuzah? And l'chora, we have to make a fundamental distinction between Ner Chanukah and mezuzah. Mezuzah is a chovas bias. If you don't have a bias, you're not mechuyev in mezuzah. But if you don't have a bias, you still have a chiyuv of Ner Chanukah. The problem is you don't have the ability to implement, to achieve the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. You don't have a bias. Ner Chanukah has to be attached to a bias. If Chabad wants to, light a public menorah, that's fine. Rav Avad Yosef has tshuvas about this. But that's not the ikar mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. The White House might be a bias, but it's not a house. It's not a bias. So you have this person who doesn't have a bias. In the case of mezuzah, the bias is a machayev. You don't have a bias, you're not chayev. But in the case of Ner Chanukah, Tosfos is saying you are chayiv in the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, even if you don't have a bias. But you don't have a bias, how are you going to fulfill the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah? You can't just run through the streets and put a Chanukiah on top of your car and call it a bias. So the Rabbanan made a special takana allowing a person who's chayiv in a mitzvah but doesn't have the wherewithal to fulfill the mitzvah to do so by seeing Yenem's Ner Chanukah. Now, I don't know if Yudi and Bobby are here. I don't know. I see names on the screen. I have no clue if there's anyone behind those names.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, Yudi is here. I hear his voice. You know, the Gemara has in Masechta Gittin, what's the law if you hear a voice? And he says, you know, he gives you a shlichus. So do you assume there's a person there or it's just a shade? So I don't know.
So I didn't want to.
Nice to see you, Bobby. Okay, so there's something called voice recognition. So in Yudi's case, maybe we could apply voice recognition. Okay. So again, l'chora, when Tosfos wants to know why is it that they made a takana of birchas haroa in the case of Ner Chanukah, but not in the case of mezuzah, Tosfos seems to be assuming when he asks that kasha that Ner Chanukah is a chovas bias. If you don't have a bias, you're not chayiv in Ner Chanukah. And he doesn't understand why Ner Chanukah should be different than mezuzah. And in that sense, Tosfos in his kasha belongs to the school of thought of the Rambam, that there's no individual obligation to light Ner Chanukah, just like there's no individual obligation to put up a mezuzah, but rather it's a collective obligation on the bias. If you have no bias, then you're not shaykh to the chiyuv. So why did they make this takana, birchas haroa? So Tosfos actually leaves this kasha as unanswered, and it remains an outstanding kasha. We have to find a different reason for the takana of birchas haroa in Ner Chanukah, and would probably fit into one of the following categories. Either he has a bias, just he has no access to his bias. So they made a takana to facilitate his ability to fulfill the mitzvah Ner Chanukah. He has a bias, so he's chayiv in Ner Chanukah. He can't fulfill it in his bias, so he'll fulfill it vicariously through someone else's bias. Or alternatively, birchas haroa is not on the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, but rather on the Pirsum Hanes. You make a bracha thanking Hashem sha'asa nisim lavoseinu, because he saw Ner Chanukah. And Harerei, you don't make a bracha on the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah itself. There's no asher kitshanu mitzvos of itzivanu, but rather sha'asa nisim lavoseinu. So again, let's go through three possibilities of why you make a bracha on seeing someone else's Ner Chanukah, birchas haroa. Possibility number one is that even if you're not an owner of a bias, you don't have a bias, you're still obligated. Possibility number two is you're not obligated at all, but the Chachamim gave you a mitzvah of Pirsum Anes, and that Pirsum is generated by someone else's Ner Chanukah that you saw. Or we could say that you do have a bias, and therefore you're chayiv. In the first understanding, we're saying he has no bias. So the Rabbanan made a takana on behalf of someone who doesn't have an obligation in their Chanukah. And he'll fulfill at least the mitzvah of Pirsum Anes. The other possibility is that even in the absence of having a bias, he's chayiv in the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. Just he doesn't know how to, he doesn't have the ability to be makayim the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, so they gave him that opportunity through Re'iyah. And in that sense, Re'iyah now becomes a kiyum of Ner Chanukah. And the third possibility is to say that if he doesn't have a bias, he's not chayav at all in the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. And this is another, a zaytig kiyum, a separate, independent kiyum of Re'iyah, of Pirsum. But we're left with the original question as to whether or not someone without a bias is chayiv in the mitzvah Ner Chanukah. If he has a bias, just he's not able to be madlik, okay, he has a chiyuv, and he doesn't know how to be mekayim it, so we'll give him that opportunity of birchas hariyah through Yedem's ner. So that's just facilitating his ability to be Mekayim mitzvah because he obligated the mitzvah. The other way is to say, no, he's not obligated at all if he doesn't have a bias. And only if he has a bias, but he can't be Mekayim in his bias, then they gave him Birchas HaRe'iyah. Or to say, no, if he doesn't have a bias, he's not Chayiv in Ner Chanukah, and Birchas HaRe'iyah is a separate entity unto itself, a kiyum of Re'iyah, a kiyum of person. So Tosas really seems to be in the camp of the Rambam that the chiyuv of Ner Chanukah is a chiyuv bias. And therefore Tosas says, if he has no bias, then he's not chayiv in the mitzvah Ner Chanukah. It should be like mezuzah, and Tosas doesn't understand why or how to justify the Birchas HaRe'iyah. And that, I think, is exactly the way the Rambam would have the same problem. We'd have to say the Birchas HaRe'iyah is either for someone who has a bias or it's a different kiyum entirely. It's not the real McCoy kiyum of Hadlakas Ner Chanukah. Now, let me jump ahead for a moment to the issue of achsenoi and see how it impacts on what we've been discussing. The Shulchan Aruch in Tafresh Ayin Aleph, Seif Aleph, writes, achsenoi she'ein lo bayis, chayav lishtatev im habalabayis bepruta. So I want to analyze the Shulchan Aruch before we get to the Rambam. Shulchan Aruch is copying Rav Sheshes in the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Chav Gimel, but l'chora it makes no sense. A person is an achsenoi. He's a guest in someone's house. Lomazogin, he's eating in that house, he's sleeping in that house. On a temporary basis, he's living in that house. So Shulchan Aruch says that he's mishtatef b'pruta. He chips in for the ner, the shemen shebener. I don't get it. If he's one of the Bnei Abayis, because on a temporary basis that's where he's living, then why does he have to be mishtatef b'pruta? Are we going to ask for a pruta from every one of the Bnei Abayis? And if, on the other hand, he's not one of the Bnei Abayis, so what good is it for him to be mishtatef b'pruta? Let him light his own candle. But I'll tell you why he can't light his own candle, because he's not one of the Bnei Abayis. Now you'll ask me, Vas Artmir, why should it bother me if someone from the outside who's not one of the Bnei Abayis would come into my house and light a Ner Chanuka? The more the merrier, no? Absolutely not. Who can tell me, if I asked you as a quiz question, why is it not acceptable for someone who's outside, some fremde mensch, I don't even know him, he comes in, I need him for a Sheva brachas, whatever it is, and he lights his Hanukkah candle in my house. Why is that a problem?
It's not his house.
Yeah, it's got nothing to do with you. Ner Ishu Beso.
Okay, I'm going to say it a little differently. One ner per bais. Okay, slug me up. Why am I wrong to say one ner per bais?
Because that's not the way we do it.
Why don't we do it that way?
Because
I'm pressing you for one word. I'm looking for one word. I'll give you a hint. It starts with a mem. Ends with a nun. Mahadrin, excellent. Mahadrin ner ish l'kol echad v'echad. So Berzon, what are you telling me? One ner per house. It can't be so. Mahadrin madlikim ner l'kol echad v'echad. And that's what Joe, you were saying. That's not the way we do it. Every member of the household will light his own ner. I'll tell you a secret. That only makes sense for the Bnei Abayis. The Mahadrin of ner l'chol echad v'echad only applies to the Bnei Abayis. And I'll tell you why. Because the Hidur of ner l'chol echad v'echad is so that somebody walking by my house will see on the first night of Hanukkah, or I could still call it the first night, right? Just joking. Anyway, on the first night of Hanukkah, he sees 5 candles. So what does he know? That there are 5 people in the house. Again, we're going to have to see how that works out with Mahadrim, Mina Mahadrim, because then you add on the second day, you double the number of the candles and how many. So you no longer have a heker how many Bnei Abayis there are. But in any event, let's just do it the simple way, without getting too complicated. Sometimes the laws of Hanukkah become very complicated. But on the first night, there's no Mahadrim, Mina Mahadrim. So there's only Mahadrim. So ner l'chol echad v'echad. So there are 5 Bnei Abayis, we light 5 candles. Somebody from next door, from across the street, wants to light in my house. It's ner ishu beso. It's one ner for the entire house. Ella what? It's Mahadrin. There's no Mahadrin for someone who's not part of the bias. Now, on the contrary, it undermines the Mahadrin, because now the spectator mistakenly comes to the conclusion that how many Bnei Abayis are there? Not 5, but 6. It messes up the whole Mahadran. Shall I say it flukes up the whole system? So what's his Mishtati B'Pruta? If he's considered one of the Bnei Abayis because he's eating with us, he's sleeping with us, he's living with us, he's got a roof over his head, we gave him a guest room, so he doesn't have to be Mishtati B'Pruta. Like all the other Bnei Abayis, he's Yotze with one Adlaka, one Ner. Ella, what? We want him to light his own Ner. So why is he being Mishtati B'Pruta? He cannot light his own Ner if he's not one of the Bnei Abayis. If he was one of the Bnei Abayis, he wouldn't have to be Mishtati B'Pruta. Elamai, you're telling me he's not one of the Bnei Abayis, and that's why he has to be Mishtati B'Pruta. Well, what good is it if he's Mishtati B'Pruta? He still doesn't have the ability to light a candle in that bias if he's not one of the Bnei Abayis. So the halachic physics, if I could call it that, of Achsanoi and Mishtati B'Pruta is very, very complicated. Not a simple halacha to understand what Mishtati B'Pruta means. Is he chayiv in adlaka or is he not chayiv in adlaka? If he's one of the Bnei Abayis, then his chayiv adlaka was fulfilled vicariously through the adlaka of the bayis. He doesn't need to be Mishtati B'Pruta. If, on the other hand, he's not one of the Bnei Abayis, we can't invite someone from outside the house to light a candle in the house. Ella, what? You're going to tell me he'll be Yotze with the adlaka of the Baal Abayis? Why? He's not one of the Bnei Abayis. So what are you going to answer? Well, the bias is equipped with a Ner Chanuka. It's not his bias, as you said before. And at this point, we're tempted to, are you familiar with the proverbial statement, drop the ball? There's like a fumble here. I don't know what you call it in hockey. I'm sure there's a word for you hockey players. By the way, do you have any bus drivers that are not anti-Semitic over there? Oh, Canada, oh, Canada. Anyway, but there's plenty of anti-Semitism in America. You don't have to fork on Canada to. Anyway, so we have to drop the ball on what we said until now. We said until now, based on the Rambam, that the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is a chovas bayis. But if that be the case, then the Achsanoi is either one of the members of the bayis, and therefore he's Yotze with Adlok of the bayis, or alternatively, he's not a member of the bayis, he's a fremder, he's outside, and there would be no chiyuv. He's not obligated in the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. He doesn't have a bias. So we're going to have to say that there are tzvei dinim in Ner Chanukah. A brisket tzvei dinim. There's a chovas bias, which means that the bias has to be equipped with an Ner Chanukah, and on top to boot is a chovas gavra. The Chachamim established an obligation incumbent upon every individual to light Ner Chanukah. But how's he going to do so? He's not part of the bias. He can't light his own Ner because it's Ner Yishu Beso and he's not part of the bias. We're going to have to say that there's some sort of din of shlichus over here. That he's appointing this achsanoi, this visitor, this guest, is appointing his host as his shliach. But that's no good either. There's no shlichus in mitzvahs. if I have a chovas gavra to put on tefillin, I can't ask you to put on tefillin for me. And if I have a chovas gavra to eat matzah, I can't ask you to eat matzah for me. I can't ask you to blow shofar for me. I can't ask you to shake a lulav for me. I got to do it myself. So if the halacha requires a chovas gavra of a ma'aseh adlaka, then you can't appoint a shliach. So we're back to square one. We understand that the achsanoi, even though he's not one of the bnei habayis, is obligated in the mitzvah of ner Chanuka. He has the chovas gavra, because in addition to the chovas bayis, there's a chovas gavra. But he can't appoint a shliach to fulfill that chova. So the only other opportunity is for him to light it himself. But he can't light it himself because he's not one of the bnei habayis. So that look in the bias is meaningless. Not only is it meaningless, it's even negative. It undermines the kiyum of Mahadrin. So the Chachamim came up with a new mechanism that only operates in Ner Chanukah. It doesn't operate in any other mitzvah. And it somehow obviates the need for shlichus. And that's called the shtakfus b'prut. You're the host, and I'm the guest. Your hadlaka relates to me. Why? You can't be my shliach. Where do I fulfill my chiyuv hadlaka as a chovas gavra? Through you, through the host. And the answer is because the host is lighting my ner Chanukah. The ner Chanukah belongs to the achsanoi. He paid for it. He's a shutaf. He is a part owner, a partner in the owner of the shemen. So when the host lights the ner of the achsanoi, the lighting of the host now relates to the achsanoi, as if the achsanoi himself had lit the ner. Again, he can't light his own ner because that would undermine the Mahadrin. That he can't do. And not only that, if he lights his own ner, that ner will not be a ner of the bayis because he's not one of the bnei habayis. So the ner of that bayis couldn't relate to him. But he can fulfill his chovas gavra through the ma'aseh adlaka of the host. Again, I don't care which one of the bnei habayis lights, as long as he's bar mitzvah. But how does he link up to the ma'aseh adlaka of the host? I understand that adlaka is in a bayis, so that's fine. But how do we get that adlaka to relate to him? He can't appoint the Baal Bayis as a shliach because there's no shlichus in mitzvahs. The answer must be hishtatfus b'prut. A mechanism, I call it halachic chemistry, by which the adlaka of the host relates to the achsanoi, as if the achsanoi himself had fulfilled his own personal obligation. But now we look at the Rambam. Perek Dalet Halacha Yud Aleph. So until now we did Perek Dalet Halacha Aleph. Now we're fast forwarding to Perek Dalet Halacha Yud Aleph. Oreach shemadlikim olav b'toch beiso eino tzarich lahadlik olav b'mokom shenisareach bo. That's the ratio of halacha Yud Aleph. We'll get to the sefer in just a minute. What is the Rambam saying here? This Oreach has a bias. The adlaka in his bias is equal to a kiyum mitzvah of ner Chanukah for him, even though he's not in the bias. But you might ask me, well, he's an oreach. If he's an oreach, he has a bias, and it's not his bias. So what do you have to answer about that? How could this oreach be miyotzi zayin his chovas hadlokas ner Chanukah because his wife is madlik, or one of the bnei bias is madlik back in his bias? He has a new bias. He's got a light in this bias. What good is it if they light in that bias? But what's the answer? Come on, guys, be sharp.
He's already fulfilled it with them.
Why?
The mitzvah is not twice.
He's now in this bias. Well, what good is it if they light in that bias? You know,
the main mitzvah is on the house. His is only partial. That's not as strong as the bias. Did you say? The mitzvah is on his being part of it. It's a part, but the main mitzvah is the on the house, that the house should have it. So
no, but I'm asking you a different question, Joe. I admit that the main mitzvah is on his bias, but what is his bias? Will the real bias please stand up? He's living now in your bias. He's packed in. You have a guest room, Joe?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm coming to live in your guest room.
Fantastic.
Or the other way around. If Jeff doesn't want to have you can live in my house here, okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
So now the guest is living in his host's house. He's eating there, he's sleeping there. He packs in. He brings his boombox, he brings all his siyud, all his materials, you know what I mean? All the stuff he's carrying from Canada to give out to the Chayalim, he's bringing it all together here to Ramat Beit Shemesh. So what good is it if they light in Darton, in Toronto, Canada? So the answer has to lie in these two words, Ikar and Tofel. Can you develop it? I don't know if Yudi's here or Bobby's here, I don't know. David is here, I think, or is that just that's just
David.
No,
it's David.
That's him? Oh.
Yeah.
Hi, David. Hey, look at that. So what do you say?
So again, the Iker is where he stations his house most of the time. What is his
and he's now an achsenoi. That's called what? Not dira Ikar, but dira tofel. There's Ikar and there's tofel. There's primary and secondary. So madlikin, the Rambam says madlikin also bebeso. That's his dira ikris. Let's say, for example, there he's chayav in mezuzah. Here he's packing into the house for a day, for a week, for a month. He's not chayav in mezuzah. I'm just giving an example. He doesn't have to pay municipal taxes to the Iriyah of Beit Shemesh. Why? Because his Ikar Dira is in Canada. Clear? So therefore, if his bias, which is Ikar Dira, is equipped with an Erchanik, he's part of the mitzvah, the Rambam says. And when he's an Achsanoi, does he have to join together with the lighting of the Baal Bias? Absolutely not. He's already discharged his duty. That's the ratio of the Rambam. Now we go on to the Sefer. Ein lo bias lahadlik olav bo. Oh, he has no bias, or there's no one in the house. Tzorech lahadlik b'makom shenesareach bo. He has a chivad adlaka. This is the chovas gavra that we spoke about before. The chovas bias he doesn't have because he has no bias. Imagine the case of a single guy, no longer lives with his parents, and he goes in and out of the dormitory, he sleeps on the streets, I don't know where he sleeps. He doesn't have a bias, but he's chayiv in ner Chanukah. How does he fulfill his chayiv of ner Chanukah? The Rambam writes, Mishtatef imoyim b'shemen. Hishtatfus. So by Mishtatet Bipruta, he fulfills his Chovas Gav. Now the Rambam should have said Ein lo bayis is Eino tzarich lahadlik, because the Rambam already established at the beginning of Perek Daled that the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is a chovas bayis. So it's not a chova on a gavra like tefillin or sukkah or matzah. So let me ask you a question. If I don't own a lulav, am I potter from the mitzvah of lulav? Obviously not. I have to buy a lulav. If I don't have a house, am I chayav in the mitzvah of mezuzah, and therefore I have to buy a house in order to fulfill the mitzvah of mezuzah? Absolutely not. The mitzvah of mezuzah emerges as an obligation because I own a house. If I don't own a house, there's no chiyuv. It's not like lulav, which is a chovas gavra. Now, what happens in Ner Chanukah? Do I have to buy a bias in order to fulfill the mitzvah Ner Chanukah?
You have to be in a house, because that puts you somewhere in that concept. If you're on the road, you're not
So
somewhere in it.
Let me just quote to you an interesting Rambam. This is a Rambam in Perek Alf Milchas Brachos. The Rambam writes that the mitzvah of Chayv Lishtadel Lidov Kegon Tefillin, Sukkah, Lulav, Shofar, you have to make sure that you fulfill your chova. Lefisha Adam Chayv on Kol Ponim Lasos. But yesh mitzvah she'ena chova el doma l'rishus kegon mezuzah u'maker she'ena dem chayav lishkon bebayis hachayav b'mezuzah k'dei sheyasa mezuzah el im rotza lishkon kol yoma bi'oel or b'spina yeshet v'chein eno chayav livnos bayis k'dei lasos maker. Then the Rama writes v'chol mitzvah she'en midivrei sofrim Kigon Mikra Megillah Adlokas Ner Shabbos Adlokas Ner Chanukah. The Rambam says that he's chayav in the mitzvah. So again, the Rambam contrasts mezuzah with Ner Chanukah. He's got mezuzah classified on its own, and he doesn't have to live in a house or rent a house or buy a house in order to be chayav in mezuzah. If he doesn't have mezuzah, he's potter. And yet the Rambam has a whole list of mitzvahs which are midivreim, and those mitzvahs are chova. And the example of a mitzvah that's chova means he has to go out and find a way of fulfilling it. He's got hadlokas ner Chanukah. So I don't get it. If he doesn't have a house, then he doesn't have to buy a house, rent a house in order to fulfill Ner Chanukah. So why does the Rambam say that Ner Chanukah is a chova, just like Mikra Megillah is a chova? So you see clearly that the Rambam holds that Ner Chanukah is a chovas gavra. And even if you don't have a house, you don't have to buy a house, but you chayav in Ner Chanukah. I don't get it. Again, the proof seems to be that in Ner Chanukah, the Rambam establishes a twofold mitzvah. There's a chovas bias and a chovas gavra.
Right? Would you not say
chovas gavra without a chovas bias? And you see
Would
it
you
in
not-
Aksanoi. He has a Chovas Gavra that they had to try to find a method by which he could fulfill his Chovas Gavra. And you see it from the Ram in Ilchas Brachos that even if he doesn't have a bias, he's Chayiv in Ner Chanukah.
But maybe we're looking at it from not necessarily the right way. Would it be that the Rambam's thinking that the best way, the best way to do it is if you have a house? You're thinking that, right? And that's the concept is the best way. What ner ishubaisa? That's the best way to do it.
Right. So we're going to have to say the following: that the main ikar chiyuv of mitzvahs ner Chanukah is on the bias. That's the ideal mitzvah. There's also a chovas gavra, and that's clear from the Ram in Ilchas Brachos that you have to consider ner Chanukah like you consider Megillah. He's got to go out of his way. He can't say, well, I don't have a Megillah. He's got to find a place where they can read a Megillah for him. And in Chanukah, he has to find a way of being Mekayim his chovas gavra of ner Chanukah, even if he doesn't have a bias. So how will he fulfill his mitzvah? So there are two opportunities. There's Birchas HaRoeh. He sees someone else's ner Chanukah. Or he's an Achsanoi. And he's Mishtativ B'Pruta. But these are all different methods and possibilities for which he is Mekayim his chovas gavra. Okay. Now, I wanted to go back as we end the Shia today to the beginning of Hilchas Chanukah. And the Rambam says, "V'bayisheni shemolchu yavon v'gozu gzeros," and we've spoken about this in the past, that the Rambam in a very atypical way gives the whole historical background. In order to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Pirsa Nes, you got to know about the Nes. There's nothing in Tanakh in the Nes. Fine. We've also spoken in the past about how the Rambam constantly refers back to Megillah. And the Rambam says who's ever obligated in Megillah is obligated in Chanukah. And the Rambam says mitzvah divrei sofrim, kikriyas HaMegillah. We discussed in the past that Rav Soloveitchik has this breakthrough shita that you cannot establish a mitzvah d'Rabbanan unless there's a kiyum d'oraisa. And the breakthrough, the first frontier for that concept was Mikra Megillah. So Ner Chanukah is a creation of the Rabbanon, but like Megillah, it has a Kiyum Doraisa. And what is the Kiyum Doraisa Ner Chanukah? The Rav used to vacillate, but it's either Hodala Nes or Pirsa Nes, or sometimes the Rav used to say it's Kiddush Hashem. And he had a diuk in the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvahs Mitzvah test that even in front of the Goyim, there's Kiddush Hashem. Rabbeinu Daniel Abavli, etc., etc. However, I would like to emphasize today a different part of the Rambam, be medayik in his language. Let me just take a minute to get the Rambam. The Rambam writes, after the great detailed historical background, ומפני זה התקינו חכם שבוס הדור, שיהיו 8 היומים האלו, שתחילתם מליל 25 בכסלו, ימי שמחה והלל. And the Rambam adds the word simcha. In the Brisa of my Chanukah back in Shabbos Chafal, Chaf Beis, it doesn't say anything about simcha. It says Yimei Halal V'Odoyim. Now, if you look in the Frankel Rambam, he's got in the back comments and Marmakomos on the Rambam. 1 second. So it's Perek Gimel Halacha Gimel. Let me just Yemei Simcha v'Halel. He writes, Seuda b'yamim elu mitzvah v'lo rishus. And he quotes the Meiser Okeach, one of the major commentaries on the Rambam. In other words, the Rambam's Simcha is not part of Halel, right? The Rambam writes, Yemei Halel v'Simcha, or what does it say? Simcha v'Halel. What did I say? Yemei Simcha v'Halel. So the question is, how do you read Simcha v'Halel? The Simcha of Halel, or Simcha stop Halel. And the Rokeach read the Rambam in the latter way, and therefore he established that there's a mitzvah of Suda according to the Rambam. The Mordechai actually paskins that we should have Suda Mishta on Chanuk. The Ramah is in favor of it, Ribus Mishta, Ribus Suda, but it's not Mikra Adin. But the Rambam seems to assume that these days are days of Simcha. And Simcha requires Seuda. Might have enough Kamina if somebody left out Al Nisim and bench. But be that as it may, the Rambam might have established Chanuka as Yomim Tovim, as days of Yontif. And Yontif means Simcha. So, for example, if I were to ask you, what time of the day is the proper time for Seuda, according to the Rokeach's interpretation, the Rambam and the Mordechai Shita? Is it dafka when the Neros are lit? If it's a Yontif, then it should incorporate the entire day. Any time during the day, 24 hours times 8, that you have a Suda, you can make it into a Suda's mitzvah for Chanukah. Eat your donuts, whatever you eat, the milchiks. So it's interesting. I saw in the Bach, in Tafresh Ayin, Siman Tafresh Ayin, the first Siman in Shulchan Aruch of Hilchas Chanukah, he writes that Chanu Chafei, the Natrikun, and Chanu Chania means Bitul Malacha. And he writes that because they established these days as days of Yontiv, therefore there's an Isur Malacha. Well, we're really going very far now. We started with the possibility of establishing these days as days of Simcha. From there we went on to say the days of Yontiv, and from there we're going on to say that there's Isur Malacha. And apparently the Shibolei Leket, the Orchos Chaim, all this stuff is annotated in the Encyclopedia Talmudit. He writes that the Isur Malacha should be the entire day, if it's the day of Yontif. Something to think about. No. Whoever heard of an Isur Malacha the entire day because Chanukah is a Yontif? Whoever heard of Simcha b'Mishnah the entire day? That itself is rare. Okay, but we do recognize the minhag of having extra pseudos, but Isur Malacha the entire day, my gosh. I
That was
mentioned
tried
to Joe.
by
what?
Purim also. It was tried by Purim also, because you're in Dike and McGill, you see, they said, the Russian, but anyway, when they accepted the Xeris Chanan, they left out the Yom Tov part.
Right.
They didn't hold by Zman by Purim.
So they never accepted Purim as a day of Yisur Malach.
Right. Well, the Chacham tried to do that, but it was
rejected.
rejected. Yeah, that's a word.
And I was saying maybe in the case of Hanukkah it was accepted. I don't know.
Oh, you're on the Rabbah, both of them, right?
It's a lot to think about here if you talk about an Yisur Malach. Okay, Rabosa, I wish you a happy Hanukkah. And let me know if you're free next week. I mean, we're having a Masiba for our family on Wednesday of next week, but I'm not sure exactly what time we're starting, so it might work out. All right, you'll let me know if you're free. So let me wish you a freilich and Chanukah, wonderful Chanukah. We should hear good news.